The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the village of Amani, bathing the cemetery in a golden hue that made it seem less ominous than it truly was. Ada and her friends lingered near the rusted gates, their laughter echoing off the worn headstones. The cemetery had long been a taboo place, especially the grave of Captain Okechukwu, a veteran from a war long past. The elders spoke of him in reverence, describing his courage and sacrifices for his people. But to Ada, it was all folklore, a relic of an old world she had no respect for. "I don't see what the big deal is," Ada said, leaning casually against the gate. "It's just a bunch of rocks and bones. What's so scary about that?" Her friends exchanged nervous glances. Bisi, her closest friend, tried to change the subject. "Let's just go back to the market, Ada. This place gives me the creeps." But Ada wasn't one to back down from an opportunity to prove her fearlessness. "Creeps?" she scoffed. "You all need to grow up. Nothing is going to happen." Her voice rose with confidence as she gestured dramatically toward the graveyard. "I could walk right in there, dance on those graves, and come out without a scratch." One of the boys in the group smirked. "Prove it then." Ada raised an eyebrow. "What, you want me to go in there?" "Go in," the boy said, his tone playful but challenging. "Better yet, go to Captain Okechukwu's grave. The old man's supposed to be the scariest one, right?" The group fell silent. Even in their teasing, the name carried weight. Captain Okechukwu was a hero-turned-tragic figure, betrayed by those he trusted. His grave, marked by an imposing headstone etched with his rank and regiment, was a site of reverence. No one dared disturb it, out of respect or fear of the whispers that claimed his spirit still lingered. Ada smirked, sensing their unease. "You're all scared of a dead man," she said, shaking her head. "Fine, I'll go. And I'll do something you'll never forget." With her phone in hand, Ada pushed open the cemetery gates, the creak of rusted hinges breaking the silence. The others stayed behind, watching from a distance. Bisi called out, "Ada, don't! It's not funny!" But Ada waved her off, already striding confidently through the overgrown path. The air felt cooler inside the cemetery, but she ignored it. Her eyes scanned the headstones until she found it. Captain Okechukwu's grave. The headstone stood taller than the rest, worn but still commanding. The words, duty, honor, sacrifice, were etched beneath his name alongside his military insignia. Ada hesitated, a strange unease settling in her chest. For a moment, she thought about turning back, but the mocking laughter of her friends echoed in her mind. She wasn't about to back down. "All right, old man," she muttered, setting her phone on a nearby grave to record. "Let's see if you're watching." She unzipped her jeans, crouching over the grave. The act of peeing was quick, but its weight felt enormous. As the last drops hit the earth, Ada stood up, brushing herself off, thinking at least it wasn't a dump. "There," she said, staring directly into the phone. "Big bad Captain Okechukwu, nothing but dirt now." Her voice barely faded before the air around her shifted. The wind, which had been light and warm, stopped entirely. The temperature plummeted, and the cemetery fell eerily silent. Ada glanced around, suddenly uneasy. She grabbed her phone, stopping the recording, and began walking briskly back to the gates. As she reached the midway point, she heard it, a low, steady crunching sound behind her, like footsteps on gravel. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly she turned, but the path behind her was empty. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The crunching stopped. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding, until she broke into a sprint. By the time she reached the gates, her friends were gone, having fled when she didn't return immediately. Ada swore under her breath, pushing past her fear and anger as she stormed toward home. That evening, Ada replayed the video she had recorded, intending to show it to her friends as proof of her bravado. But as she watched, her confidence wavered. The footage captured her act clearly enough, but in the background, something moved. Just for a second, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. "What the hell?" she muttered, rewinding the clip. She slowed it down, watching as a faint, human-like silhouette flickered behind her, then disappeared. Her stomach churned. "It's probably just a glitch," she whispered, though her voice was unconvincing. Deleting the video felt like a necessary step, a way to erase the unease growing in her chest. That night, as she lay in bed, the silence of the house felt heavier than usual. Every creak, Every distant sound made her heart race. And then, just as she began to drift off, she heard it. The slow, deliberate sound of footsteps outside her window. Ada's breath hitched. She froze, her ears straining against the darkness. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a faint scraping sound, like nails on wood. Summoning her courage, she moved to the window and peeked through the curtains. Nothing. Still, the sound lingered in her ears, echoing long after it stopped. Ada climbed back into bed, pulling the blanket over her head, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, Ada woke to chaos. Her mother's voice echoed sharply from the living room, carrying an edge of disbelief and anger that set Ada on edge. "What do you mean she did that?" her mother shouted into the phone. No, she wouldn't. Let me handle it." Ada's heart sank. She climbed out of bed, her chest tight with unease. As she padded toward the living room, her mother slammed the phone down, her face pale with fury. "Ada!" she hissed, her voice low and trembling. "What have you done?" Ada froze. "What do you mean?" Her mother grabbed her phone, thrusting it toward her. The video, the one Ada had deleted, was playing on the screen. It had somehow resurfaced and was now circulating in the village WhatsApp groups. The comments beneath the video were scathing. "Disgusting! How dare she disrespect the dead? That grave is sacred. This girl has no upbringing. Her family should be ashamed." Ada's stomach dropped. How did they get that?" she stammered. Her mother's voice shook with rage. "I don't know, but it's everywhere. Do you understand what you've done? Do you know what this means for our family?" Before Ada could respond, her father stormed into the room. He didn't say a word. His expression was enough. He snatched the phone from her mother, replayed the video, and watched in silence, his jaw tightening with each passing second. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold. "You have embarrassed us," he said, glaring at Ada. "Do you think this is a joke? Do you think the people in this village will forgive this?" News spread faster than Ada could process. By mid-afternoon, whispers followed her wherever she went. At the market, women stopped talking the moment she walked past, their eyes boring into her with disdain. Vendors who once greeted her with smiles refused to serve her, muttering under their breath. "She's the one of them said, loudly enough for her to hear. "The one who disrespected Captain Okechukwu." Ada hurried home, her heart pounding. As she walked, she noticed small but deliberate acts of hostility. A rock thrown near her feet, a door slammed in her face when she tried to buy bread. By the time she reached her house, her skin prickled with the weight of a dozen unseen eyes watching her. The elders called a meeting that evening. Ada's parents were summoned, and though Ada begged to stay behind, her father wouldn't allow it. "You made this mess," he said, his voice clipped. "You'll face it." The meeting was held in the community hall, a modest building with wooden benches arranged in a semicircle. The room was packed, elders, veterans, gang members, and villagers alike, their faces grim. At the center of the room sat Chief Olorin, the oldest veteran in the village and a man of unwavering authority. He fixed Ada with a piercing stare as she shuffled inside, flanked by her parents. "Step forward," Chief Olorin commanded, his voice firm. Ada hesitated, glancing at her father, who nudged her forward with a hard look. She stood before the crowd, her palms clammy and her heart racing. "Do you know what you've done?" Chief Olorin asked, his tone heavy with disappointment. Ada opened her mouth but couldn't find the words. The chief continued, his voice rising. "Captain Okechukwu was a man of honor. He gave his life for this village. His grave is sacred, a reminder of the sacrifices made for your freedom, your peace, and you desecrated it. Do you have no respect?" The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement. A younger veteran stood, his fists clenched. "My father fought alongside Captain Okechukwu," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "Do you know what it feels like to see his memory treated like trash?" I didn't mean," Ada stammered, tears welling in her eyes. "Didn't mean," another elder barked. "You laughed as you did it. There's proof." The crowd erupted in angry whispers. Ada felt her chest tighten as the weight of their fury pressed down on her. She looked to her parents for support, but even her mother avoided her gaze. Chief Olorin raised a hand, silencing the room. "This is not just a matter of disrespect," he said gravely. "It is a matter of shame. Ada has brought disgrace to her family and this village, and disgrace must be met with restitution. The elders decreed that Ada and her family were responsible for restoring Captain Okechukwu's grave, both physically and symbolically. They would fund its repair, clean the entire cemetery, and hold a public apology ceremony. But even as the judgment was delivered, the anger in the room didn't dissipate. That night, Ada's family became the target of the villagers' wrath. Rocks were thrown at their house, shattering windows. Someone scrawled "disgrace" across their front door in red paint. The next morning, her father's clients began canceling appointments at his workshop. Her mother, who sold vegetables at the market, returned home empty-handed. No one would buy from her. Ada tried to go to school, but her classmates whispered and laughed behind her back. One girl bumped into her intentionally, sneering, "Maybe you should pee on my homework next, huh?" By the end of the week, Ada had stopped leaving the house altogether. The isolation, the scorn, the guilt. It was unbearable. Her once fiery personality had been extinguished, replaced by a shadow of herself. Alone in her room, Ada replayed the events in her mind, each memory cutting deeper than the last. She couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Captain Okechukwu's grave, the headstone, the words, duty, honor, sacrifice. Her act felt like a gaping wound, one she couldn't escape. Her parents, too, were at their breaking point. "What were you thinking?" her mother asked one night, her voice breaking. "Why couldn't you just listen? Now we're the ones paying for your stupidity." "I'm sorry," Ada whispered, but the words felt hollow. It was Mama Ifeoma, Ada's grandmother, who finally intervened. Hearing of the family's plight, she arrived one evening, her presence commanding yet comforting. "Come," she said to Ada, leading her to the kitchen table. "Tell me everything." For the first time, Ada broke down. She admitted to the dare, the pressure to impress her friends, and the mounting regret that had consumed her since. Mama Ifeoma listened patiently, her weathered face unreadable. When Ada finished, the old woman sighed deeply. "Child," she said, "you have angered more than the living. Disrespect like this has consequences, ones you cannot outrun." Ada's breath hitched. "What do I do?" Mama Ifeoma leaned closer, her eyes sharp. "You will make amends, but the path ahead will not be easy." The air in the village turned toxic. The whispers that had followed Ada and her family became shouts, then open threats. They couldn't step outside without feeling the weight of the community's hatred, a storm of anger that seemed to grow stronger by the day. Every glance was a dagger, every word a curse. By the end of the week, the scorn escalated into action. It started with a loud crash in the middle of the night. Ada jolted awake, her heart pounding. Her father's furious shout echoed through the house as he stormed out of his room. Ada followed hesitantly, her pulse racing. The front door was wide open, swinging on its hinges. A heavy brick lay on the living room floor, surrounded by shattered glass. Outside, someone had scrawled "traitor" across the front of their house in red paint. Ada's mother stood frozen in the hallway, her face pale. Who would do this?" she whispered. Her father turned to Ada, his face dark with fury. "This is because of you! Look at what you brought to this family!" Ada shrank back, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "Meaning doesn't matter," he roared, slamming his fist against the wall. "Your thoughtless actions have turned us into outcasts. Do you understand that? Outcasts." The next morning, Ada's father tried to board up the broken window, but the shame on his face was impossible to ignore. Neighbors walked by, their whispers audible. "She deserves worse. They should leave the village entirely. How dare they stay here after what she did?" Ada's mother didn't go to the market that day. She sat by the window, staring blankly at the road, clutching a piece of fabric in her lap. She flinched every time someone passed by. By evening, another note appeared on their doorstep. It was written on torn paper in jagged, angry letters. "Leave or we'll make you." 3 days later, Ada decided she couldn't stay locked inside any longer. The weight of guilt, fear, and isolation had become suffocating. Against her parents' wishes, she ventured into the village to buy food. As she walked, heads turned and whispers followed. She kept her gaze fixed on the ground, her chest tight with dread. At the corner of a quiet alley, someone called her name. "Hey, Ada!" the voice sneered. She turned, her stomach dropping. 3 boys stood in the alley, their faces twisted with anger. They were older than her, their broad shoulders blocking her path. She recognized one of them, Cheek, the grandson of an elder who had served alongside Captain Okechukwu. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling. Cheek stepped closer, his eyes blazing. "What do I want? I want to know what made you think you could piss on my grandfather's best friend's grave. Do you think you're special? Untouchable?" Ada stumbled back. I'm sorry." "Sorry?" Cheek spat. "Sorry doesn't fix anything. You humiliated him. You humiliated all of us." The other boys stepped forward, surrounding her. One of them shoved her shoulder, sending her stumbling against the wall. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, trembling. "Maybe we should show her what it feels like to be disrespected," one of them muttered. Cheek raised a hand, silencing him. He knelt in front of Ada, his voice low and menacing. "If it were up to me, you wouldn't be walking out of this alley, but I'm not going to dirty my hands with someone like you." He stood abruptly, glaring down at her. "You don't belong here anymore, Ada. Do yourself a favor and leave before someone decides to do more than throw rocks." The boys left, their laughter ringing in her ears. Ada stayed on the ground for what felt like hours, too shaken to move. That night, the threats reached their peak. Ada sat in her room, staring at the blank wall, her thoughts swirling with fear and guilt. Outside, the faint sound of footsteps caught her attention. At first, she thought it was paranoia, until the sound grew louder. Then came the first thud. A rock slammed against the house, followed by another. Voices outside jeered, their words slurred with alcohol and rage. "Come out, Ada! Face us, coward! Disrespectful little brat!" Her father burst into her room, his face pale. "Get down, now!" They huddled in the living room as the rocks kept coming, smashing windows and denting the walls. The mob outside grew louder, angrier. Ada's mother clutched her tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Why won't they stop?" Ada whispered, her voice trembling. "Because they hate us," her father said bitterly. "And they won't stop until you've paid for what you've done." Suddenly, the smell of smoke filled the air. Her father leapt to his feet, running to the front door. Ada followed, her heart racing. The mob had lit a small fire on their porch. Flames licked at the wooden frame, and the smoke was already seeping into the house. Her father grabbed a bucket of water, dousing the flames before they could spread. "Go!" he shouted to Ada. "Go upstairs and don't come down until I tell you." But Ada couldn't move. She stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the mob of faces outside. Some were men she'd known her whole life, people who had smiled at her just weeks ago. Now, their eyes burned with hatred. One of them stepped forward, pointing a finger at her. "Get out of this village, Ada! You've shamed us all!" Her father shoved her back into the house, slamming the door shut. By dawn, the mob had dispersed, leaving the house damaged and the family shaken. Her father sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, while her mother quietly wept. "I can't do this anymore," her father muttered. This isn't a life." Ada stood in the doorway, her hands trembling. "I'll fix it," she said softly. Her father looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Fix it? How, Ada? How do you fix something like this?" She didn't have an answer, but deep in her heart, she knew she couldn't keep running from the consequences of her actions. The only way forward was to confront the damage she had caused and find a way to make amends, no matter how painful it would be. The days after the mob's attack were marked by a heavy, suffocating silence in Ada's home. The air felt thick with blame, anger, and despair. Her father barely spoke, his shame and rage palpable. Her mother moved like a ghost through the house, her once bright eyes hollow and distant. Ada knew she couldn't stay silent anymore. The damage she had caused needed to be repaired, not just for her family's sake, but for herself. With trembling hands, Ada approached Mama Ifeoma. The old woman sat in her shaded veranda, her sharp eyes narrowing as Ada approached. "I'm ready," Ada said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to make this right." Mama Ifeoma studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Good. But know this, child. Words alone won't fix what you've broken. You need to show the village, and Captain Okechukwu himself, that you understand the weight of what you've done." The next day, Mama Ifeoma escorted Ada to the village square, where the elders had gathered. The mood was tense. The news of the attack on Ada's house had spread, but the village was still divided. Some felt the family deserved it, while others believed the mob had gone too far. When Ada stepped forward, the murmurs grew louder. Chief Oloran raised his hand for silence, his piercing gaze locking on Ada. "Why are you here?" he demanded. "Have you come to blame the village for the consequences of your actions?" Ada shook her head, her throat tight. "No, Chief. I've come to apologize. To the village, to my family, and to Captain Okechukwu." Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. "I didn't understand what I was doing. I didn't understand what that grave meant. Not just to you, but to him. I acted out of pride and ignorance, and I've brought shame to everyone. I'm so sorry." The crowd murmured, their faces a mix of anger and curiosity. Chief Olarun's expression remained unreadable. "And what will you do to prove your regret?" he asked. Ada took a deep breath. "I'll restore his grave. I'll learn his story, his sacrifice, and make sure everyone knows who he was. I'll do whatever it takes to honor his memory." Under Mama Ifeoma's guidance, Ada began her journey to redemption. She started by cleaning Captain Okechukwu's grave herself, scrubbing away the dirt and grime that had accumulated over the years. The act felt small but significant, each stroke of the brush a reminder of her guilt and a step toward healing. But Mama Ifeoma insisted that physical labor wasn't enough. "If you truly want to honor him," she said, "you need to understand his story." Ada dove into the village's history, speaking with elders and veterans who had served alongside Captain Okechukwu. Slowly, a picture began to form, a man of great courage and integrity, betrayed by those he trusted most. Through her research, Ada uncovered letters and military records that revealed the truth. Captain Okechukwu had been set up by his comrades, framed as a deserter to cover their own cowardice. He had been killed in disgrace, and his family had suffered for it. His grave wasn't just a resting place, it was a symbol of unresolved injustice. As the weeks passed, word of Ada's efforts spread through the village. Some remained skeptical, but others began to soften, seeing her dedication and remorse. Finally, with the elders' approval, a ceremony was organized to restore Captain Okechukwu's honor. The entire village gathered at the cemetery on the day of the ceremony. Ada stood before the crowd, her hands trembling as she held a bouquet of fresh flowers. The newly restored grave shone in the sunlight, its headstone cleaned and its inscriptions freshly etched. Duty, honor, sacrifice. Chief Oloran stepped forward, his voice ringing out over the crowd. "Today, we remember Captain Okechukwu, not just as a soldier, but as a man of honor who was wronged in life. Today, we restore his legacy and our respect for him." He turned to Ada. "And today, this child takes her first true step toward understanding what it means to be part of this community." Ada stepped forward, placing the flowers at the base of the grave. She knelt, her voice shaking as she spoke. "Captain Okechukwu, I disrespected you in the worst way. I can't undo what I've done, but I promise to carry your story forward. I promise to honor you, always." The ceremony marked a turning point. While not everyone forgave Ada immediately, the act of publicly acknowledging her mistakes and dedicating herself to restoring Captain Okechukwu's honor began to heal the rift between her family and the community. Her parents, once consumed by shame, began to hold their heads high again. Her father reopened his workshop, and her mother returned to the market, where neighbors slowly started speaking to her again. Ada, meanwhile, continued her work at the cemetery, helping maintain the graves of other veterans as a way to show her gratitude. Though Ada had begun to rebuild her life, the weight of her actions never fully left her. She often returned to Captain Okechukwu's grave, sitting in silence and reflecting on the man she had dishonored. The nightmares of that night in the cemetery lingered, and she avoided dark, empty places, haunted by the memory of footsteps that weren't her own. The scars on the family's home from the attack remained, a visible reminder of the cost of her defiance. But over time, those scars became symbols of resilience, proof that even in the face of hatred and division, redemption was possible. The days after the ceremony were quieter, but the scars of Ada's actions lingered. She had begun to mend the rift between her family and the village, yet the path to redemption was far from complete.